The world was not built for her. It was built for the heavy footsteps of men, for the sharp lines of their suits and the certain thunder of their voices. Her world was smaller. A kitchen warm with the smell of bread, a garden where colors burst from the soil, a church pew where hymns rose to the heavens. But the hymns were not enough. The prayers were not enough, because outside her garden the air was thick with a different kind of heat. A heat that did not warm but burned. It was the heat of 1,000 silent no's. It was the heat of a sign on a water fountain, a word whispered on a bus, a look that could strip you bare on a crowded street. She was a woman and she was black, and the world had built 2 walls around her and called it a life. Her name was Clara. Her hands were strong from kneading dough, her heart was soft from lullabies. She saw the way her son's shoulders tightened when he walked home from school. She saw the light in her daughter's eyes dim just a little each time she was told she could not. Clara's love was a fierce thing. A quiet storm gathering in her soul. One evening her son came home. His face was a mask of hurt and shame. A man had called him a name. A name that was not a name but a weapon. Clara held him. She felt his tears on her neck. And the quiet storm broke. The next morning she put on her best dress. It was Sunday blue. She polished her shoes until they shone. She walked past her garden. She walked past the church. She walked straight to the city library, a grand building of stone that seemed to frown upon the street. Her heart was a wild bird in her chest. Her breath was a shallow thing. But her feet, they were made of iron. She climbed the steps. Each one was a mountain. She pushed the heavy door. The air inside was cold and smelled of old paper and judgment. The librarian, a pale woman with spectacles perched on her nose, looked up. Her eyes were 2 chips of ice. "Can I help you?" The words were not helpful. They were a barricade. "I would like a library card, please." Clara's voice was a tremor, but it was clear. The woman's lips tightened into a thin line. "I am sorry. We do not issue cards to your people. It is policy." The word policy landed between them like a stone. It was a clean word, a cold word, a word that tried to hide the ugliness inside. Clara did not look away. She had expected this. She had practiced this. "My people pay taxes. My children deserve to read." Her voice grew stronger with each word. The storm inside was now a steady wind. The librarian's face hardened. "You need to leave. Or I will call the police." Clara stood her ground. She became a statue of defiance right there on the polished floor. "I will wait. I will wait until you give me what is rightfully mine." The librarian picked up the telephone. Her voice was a hissed whisper into the receiver. Others in the library looked up. Their faces were a mixture of shock and curiosity, and for one young white woman a dawning understanding. Clara did not move. She felt the weight of every stare. She was a solitary oak in an open field. The silence in the room was louder than any noise. Then the sirens came. 2 officers in blue uniforms entered the library. Their boots were loud on the floor. The older one, his face weary, said, "Ma'am, you need to come with us." "On what charge?" Clara asked, her voice now steady as stone. "Disturbing the peace." "Trespassing." "I am not trespassing. I am a citizen. I am asking for a library card." The younger officer reached for her arm. His touch was electric with menace. Clara did not resist. She walked with them, her head high. They led her out of the cold library into the blinding sun. A small crowd had gathered. She saw her neighbor Mrs. Evans, her hand flying to her mouth. She saw the young white woman from the library, her face pale and stricken. And she saw her own children standing on the corner, their eyes wide with terror and a terrible pride. As the police car door closed, she gave them a small nod. "A promise. I am doing this for you." The jail cell was a cage of concrete and steel. It smelled of despair and disinfectant. They took her purse. They took her belt. They put her in a cell with other women. Their eyes were hollow. But when they saw Clara, a new woman charged with wanting to read a book, a slow respect kindled in their gazes. That night, lying on a thin cot, Clara felt fear. It was a cold serpent coiling in her stomach. What would happen to her job? What would happen to her children? But beneath the fear was something harder. A bedrock of resolve. She had broken the silence. She had made herself seen. The word spread through her community like a wildfire carried on the wind. Clara, the baker's wife. Clara, who sang in the choir. She had challenged the library. She had been arrested for knowledge. At first there was fear. Then there was admiration. Then there was action. The next morning 20 women stood on the library steps. They were teachers and maids and seamstresses. They wore their Sunday best. They carried Bibles and they carried a shared silence. They did not shout. They did not sing. They simply stood. They were a wall of quiet strength. The librarian came out, her face a thundercloud. She threatened to call the police again. The women did not move. They were rooted in their righteousness. The police came. They arrested them all. The paddy wagons were filled with quiet women, their heads held high. The newspapers wrote about it. The disturbance at the library. The photograph showed a line of black women, their faces calm, their postures regal, being led away in handcuffs. The image was a seismic shock to the sleeping conscience of the town. A young reporter, a woman named Eleanor, saw the photo. She felt a pull, a calling. She went to the colored part of town. She found Clara being released on bail. Clara's home was full of people. The air was thick with talk and strategy and prayer. Eleanor expected anger. She found instead a profound dignity. "Can I tell your story?" Eleanor asked. Clara looked at her. "Tell them we are tired. Tell them our children's minds are hungry. Tell them we will no longer wait for crumbs from the table. We are building our own table." The next day the story ran. It was not on a back page. It was on the front. It quoted Clara. It showed the photograph. It asked a simple question. What kind of town arrests its mothers for wanting to read to their children? The city council called an emergency meeting. The air in the chamber was thick with tension. Old men with red faces pounded their fists. They spoke of tradition and order. But a new voice spoke too. A young councilman, his voice shaking with nerves, said, "Perhaps tradition can be wrong. Perhaps order without justice is just oppression." The vote was close. But the world was watching now. The library policy was changed. It was a victory. Small and hard one. But Clara knew it was just one brick removed from a mighty wall. The women of the community felt a new power. They had stood together and the wall had trembled. They formed a group. The Women's League for Equality. Their meetings were in churches and living rooms, in the back rooms of businesses. They were a tapestry of courage woven from many threads. There was Sarah, a teacher who organized parents to demand better books for their children. She stood before the school board, her voice clear and sharp as a bell, listing the injustices in the curriculum. There was Miriam, a maid who worked for a wealthy family downtown. She began to quietly organize the other domestic workers. They asked for fair wages, for a day off each week, for simple human respect. They risked everything. Their jobs, their homes, their safety. And there was Eleanor, the reporter. She became their chronicler, their voice to the white world. She wrote about their struggles, their strategies, their lives. She faced ridicule from her colleagues. She was called a traitor, a radical. But she had seen the truth in Clara's eyes, and she could not unsee it. The struggle moved to the lunch counters. Young students inspired by the mothers sat on stools that were not meant for them. They ordered coffee with cream. They were refused. They were spat on. They had food thrown at them. They sat. They did not fight back. Their nonviolence was a weapon more powerful than any fist. Clara and the other women were there. They did not sit at the counters. They stood behind the students. They formed a protective circle, a wall of prayer and song. When a young man was dragged from his stool, his face bloody, Clara would be there to wipe his brow, to whisper a hymn of strength into his ear. They were the mothers of the movement. Their courage was a deep root system feeding the young trees. The opposition grew uglier. The phone call started in the dead of night. Harsh voices filled with hate. A cross was burned on Clara's lawn. The flames licked at the night sky, a symbol of pure terror. Her husband wanted her to stop. For the children, he pleaded, his eyes hollow with fear. Clara looked at the charred scar on her grass. She thought of her son. She thought of his future. If I stop now, she said, then they win. They burn a piece of wood and they burn our future. I cannot let that happen. The violence escalated. A march they organized was met with a mob. Men with clubs and hate in their eyes. The police stood by and watched. The air was filled with screams and the sickening thud of wood on flesh. Clara saw Sarah the teacher fall, a gash opening on her forehead. She saw young people she had known since they were babies being beaten to the ground. She ran to Sarah, she cradled her head in her lap. She used her own scarf to staunch the bleeding. In that moment of chaos and pain, Clara felt a rage so pure it was like a fire. But she did not raise her hand. She raised her voice. She began to sing. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound. One by one others joined. The song rose above the violence, a strange and powerful shield. The mob hesitated, confused by this weapon they did not understand. They were arrested again. Hundreds of them. The jails were overflowing with hope and righteousness. They sang freedom songs that echoed through the concrete corridors. They shared stories. They built a community within a cage. Clara looked around her. She saw the young students, their eyes bright with idealism. She saw the women her own age, their faces lined with weariness and resolve. She saw that the movement was not a single act but a river fed by many streams. Upon her release, she was met with news. The Voting Rights Act had passed. It was a monumental victory. People danced in the streets. There was a feeling that a mountain had been moved. But Clara felt a complicated joy. She knew the law was a tool, not a cure. The real work, the work of changing hearts, was just beginning. She dedicated the rest of her life to that work. She ran for the local school board. She won. She sat at the table where decisions were made. She used the library card she had fought for to research policy. She used the voice she had found to speak for those who were still unheard. Years later, an old woman with silver in her hair, Clara, returned to the library. It was the same building, but the air inside felt different. Lighter. A young black girl was sitting at a table, a tower of books beside her. She was writing a report on Clara. On the Women's League. She looked up and saw the old woman watching her. She recognized her from the pictures. "Are you Clara?" she asked, her voice full of wonder. Clara smiled. "I am." The girl's eyes were wide. "You were so brave." Clara shook her head gently. "It is not about being brave, child. It is about being so full of love for your people that your fear becomes a small thing. We were just mothers. We wanted a better world for our children." She looked at the girl surrounded by books in a library that was now hers. She saw the unbroken line. The struggle was not over. It would never be over. But in that moment, Clara saw the harvest of her courage. It was in the mind of a young girl reading freely in a place that had once been a fortress. It was in the quiet certainty of her gaze. The long road had been walked. The story was being passed on. And the world was slowly being rebuilt for everyone.